we recently observed President's Day in this country and gave us a chance to sit down and talk about it. This is the Public Square. Dave Zanotti is here, of course. Rob Walgate, Alan C. Duncan's our producer. Jeff Sanders here. Melanie Elsie's at the table. And let's talk about President's Day. I don't think, have we ever talked about this before, Dave?
You know, it's interesting, Wayne. Sometimes you look past the obvious, right?
Yeah.
Often when we record the Public Square in this particular format, we are doing so on Mondays because that's the day that we come together as a team and we have a study and a time of prayer and an intensive time of strategic planning and all that sort of stuff. And then we usually come into studio. And so sometimes we're working on a holiday like President's Day. And so we thought, well, you know what? It's right there in front of us. It's real obvious. Maybe we ought to talk about it. Now, we've gotten more engaged in President's Day as in recent years because of the study of George Washington.
Right.
But before we get into that, we should go back and talk about the last couple of broadcasts that we've had, because the last one we had that other guy, you know, the phone a friend guy that we call in every now and then.
Dr. Allen.
Yes, Dr. William B. Allen. And he joined us. And the response of the last two broadcasts that we've done on the Public Square has been remarkable. I've been traveling this past week, and particularly across Southwest Florida, and it was astounding to me how many people came up to me and talked about the last two broadcasts.
Oh, good.
And I got texts from folks in Tennessee just last night talking about the last two broadcasts. Lots of people have been greatly encouraged when we took on the question of escapism and how does that work. And then we went back and we had Dr. Allen talk with us about escapism, and he took it to another level and talked to us about the idea of defeatism. Well, I think there are, if those two words were ever, let's put it this way. If I took one human character in American history and tried to explain that that person never yielded to either escapism or defeatism, it would have to be our first president, George Washington. Because when you look at his life from his earliest days, his life was dedicated to service to his country. And when you look at his accomplishments, in spite of the incredible odds and the remarkable number of losses, this is a guy who simply did not accept defeat. It comes as a surprise to so many people that Washington lost far more battles in the War for Independence than he ever won. In fact, Jeff, I see you shaking your head. His
Nodding,
string
yeah.
wasn't real good, was it?
No, it was not good. I mean, we think of him crossing the Delaware and defeating the Hessians at Trenton, and then a week later, the British at Princeton. But those were skirmishes. Those were raiding parties. Those were not full-scale set-piece battles. I mean, he had lost battle after battle that summer before that, and you know, he ended the war very well with the siege at Yorktown. He won that with the help of the French. His strength was that he was like a weed. He was so tenacious. You know, you stomp it out and you pull it up, and the next day that thing just pops up again. And he was like that. He just was not going to be defeated.
You know, Dave, you and I have talked many times about our conversations with David McCullough, and one of the conversations I had with him was on the book 1776, when he talked about George Washington retreating from New York in that fog, which I said was a providential fog. He said, absolutely. I'll never forget his expression, how excited he was that he felt that God had provided that escape for them.
Well, this concept of talking about divine providence and the hand of God in the midst of the creation of this country was a theme with George Washington from the very beginning to the very end. Now, I'm not suggesting that God visited him in the middle of the night and laid the plan out on what everything was going to look like. That wasn't the kind of vibrant faith and relationship that Washington had. He didn't claim that sort of first-person direction. But his life was a life surrendered from very, very young. And he felt that in his call to service, he was never alone. He also felt he was never sufficient. And he would say so quite openly and say, you know, you all want me to do this job. No man can do this task, and I'm the least of which could possibly get it done. But the only chance that we have is if God has mercy upon our efforts and upon our energies. That's translated a little into modern English, but that's pretty much what he said over and over in time again. So when you come to the American Mission Center, you walk up the stairs to the library, and there you see among all the shelves, you see 7 anchor authors. And when you start up on the upper left-hand side, there is a set of special shelves in which you have books, scores of books in a volume set on the writings of George Washington. Now, this is only a portion of the number of books that Dr. Allen actually read to create his book on George Washington, the 700-page definitive work that's sold at Mount Vernon at Washington's home. Dr. Allen was kind and gracious enough to donate us all of that original research work that he did, the very books that he used. And of course, that wasn't all. Between the Library of Congress and all the other books, he has been through over 100,000 documents written by George Washington and correspondence by Washington over his career. Well, from that, he got to the 700 pages. So you go from all those volumes, then you go to his book, which is the thick one. It's 700 pages. Then right next to that is this little book. And I still don't know how many pages it is. I have to check every time. This little book of 183 pages. And that's the book called First. That's the one I wrote on the leadership of George Washington with the help of Dr. Allen, who both mentored me in the writing process and then also was kind enough to write the foreword to this book. Now, Wayne, you'd think that a book about George Washington would be another yawn, right? There's only been tens of thousands of pieces written about George Washington over the years. But I've got to tell you something. This book and the conversation about Washington is I think there's a revival going on. And I think in no part it's been orchestrated by people like William B. Allen and David McCullough, who have decided in their careers, and of course the late David McCullough, to bring Washington back to the forefront of American history and to once again bring back what the people who lived with Washington and fought with Washington and governed with Washington, what they experienced and what an influence that Washington set up in our country. Because it seems like there's a period of time in the 20th century where Washington was completely lost. Yeah, it's like his reputation had just faded away. Well, these historians bringing back the story of Washington has had an amazing impact on the conversation. And I know this to be true because in just the last year alone, this little book that I put together with Dr. Allen's help, The Leadership of George Washington, I've been invited to major corporations and I've been invited to speak to their management teams on the leadership of George Washington.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. And recently, I was with a group of 100 business owners and leaders, and they wanted to talk about George Washington. And it's quite remarkable. All of this historical emphasis has brought back Washington. And what's really cool is that when you study the work of David McCullough and the work of William B. Allen, these are historians who went back to original source documents. Rob, I see that hand.
That's what I was going to say is the fact of the work is studying the originals. And whereas today, or if you've talked about in the early part of this century, the fact of the talking heads or the pundits you see on TV talk about Washington maybe with emotion or maybe they don't give you the full construct of what really happened historically. They're just giving you their opinion that fits the narrative of the day. But in the preface of your book, you talk about the fact that over 6,000 books have been written on George Washington. 6,000 books. Now, there's a lot of facts in those books, so we don't need to talk about the emotion of the day and get opinions. We can go look at the history of it all.
I actually think there's a lot of misinformation in the public discourse about George Washington, and I think that comes from years of habitual playing the phone game in classrooms in terms of what he said or did, where people aren't using original source materials and they're gleaning off of someone before them, misconstruing what he did, and then that leads to more misunderstanding of what he did and said.
Am I the only one that remembers primary school classrooms where in February there would be these silhouette shots of Washington and Lincoln
Oh, I remember that. Yes.
On the construction paper. Oh, yeah.
On the door entry to the classroom or on the bulletin boards. Yes.
Yeah.
Up there with all the Valentine's Day
Right,
cards.
right.
Yeah.
I remember their portraits hanging in the classroom.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I've got their portraits in my office, so
Do you?
I still celebrate.
Well, and I have to admit that even for me, this discovery was very late, and it would not have happened had it not been for Dr. Allen. I was taking a master's course with Dr. Allen, and the subject was Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I was so excited to hear Dr. Allen teach on this book because he's actually written a book titled Revisiting Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so he starts out this coursework with this question he asks, and this master's class was a group of history teachers that were working for higher credentials. So it was a postgraduate opportunity. And Dr. Allen started out talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin and said, I want you've all read the book. Remember in the opening chapters, there's we get a walkthrough. Stowe takes us into the cabin, into a slave cabin. And above the fireplace, there's a portrait hanging. And does anybody remember what that portrait was? Huh. Well, it was a portrait of George Washington.
Wow.
And he said to all of us, all these history teachers, can anyone explain why a picture of George Washington would be in a slave cabin? Well, that began an 8-week dialogue among these professors. That was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. We'll continue talking about this. Going to take a break right now. You are listening to The Public Square, and we'll continue in a moment. Back with you on The Public Square, and today we're looking back on the recent President's Day to talk about George Washington. President's Day to us is much more than a mattress sale, which has become in America, hasn't it? I mean, it's amazing how little we know. So, Jeff, let's talk about this man.
Well, what impressed me a long time ago about George Washington was that he was really a self-made man. His father died when he was a little boy, and he was essentially raised by his older brother Lawrence, whom he just adored. But as a young teen, as a later teen or in his early 20s, he went out and explored the wilds of Western Virginia.
Yeah,
pretty much by himself. I mean, he went out there. You talk about a real frontiersman, and made friends with the North American Indians there. Surveyed a lot of the land, had to live off the land. This was not a guy who had a silver spoon in his mouth with all kinds of rank and privilege. And now he did fall into some wealth early in his life, and he did, spend the rest of his days trying to make a profit off of the land that he had acquired.
Yeah, but let's define wealth, though, Jeff, back then, because wealth was defined as land, but land also carried with it tremendous cash flow liabilities, which Washington struggled mightily for his whole life to match up taking care of what he received from when his father passed away. Then when Lawrence passed away, all that property fell to him, and here's this young guy with no money.
Yeah.
And he's got to make this thing work.
And you got to pay taxes. And a lot of this land was not developed either. I mean, you got to cut the trees down. You've got to level the land if you're going to make it productive. And then he was caught up in the French and Indian War. And remember, he had never gone to a professional military academy like so many of the British officers had, or they had paid their way into rank.
He didn't come from military lineage either, so he didn't have any way in. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, he actually wanted to become a naval officer at one point in his life. But so he attached himself as a colonel of American volunteers. And along the way, as the British were marching to fight the French in what is now modern-day Pittsburgh, it was Fort Duquesne at the time, he was warning General Braddock, who was a very good general. We can't march like this in the woods, single file, or with a couple of rows of soldiers. You got to fight like the Native Americans did. We have to send out flankers and so forth. And the British, as well trained as they were ambushed, and Washington was shot at numerous times, but came away unscathed. But he gained combat experience, and he also learned the British were very formal and rigid. And if you fight on their terms, you're going to lose. But if you make them fight on your terms, things could shift in your favor. But still, I just want to point out that he did not have any special military training, and yet he was the kind of guy who could learn on the fly. He was a self-taught man. He never went to college.
That's very true. That's very true.
And he didn't have any college degrees. Everything that he learned on his own. I mean, he was home educated early in his life, and he did have a few formal tutors, but he acquired his knowledge from his insatiable desire for knowledge.
But no YouTube videos, no internet explorations.
No seminars.
Think of what was available to him as learning tools. I'm serious. I mean, for someone to be of his stature and learn what he learned, it was incredible accomplishments.
He probably would watch YouTube videos had he been around now, but
he would be making YouTube.
He would have his own show of how to save homesteads.
Well, and you look at he wrote the rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. This is, how many is this? What is this, 110 or so rules of civility? How old was he when he wrote those?
I think he might have been 13, 12, something like that. He was a young
He
kid.
was young, right? That's the point.
Yeah, I think it was 11 years old. Yeah, I think
11 years old. So just imagine an 11-year-old having the foresight or the wherewithal to do that.
And that kind of penmanship.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
Well, and what's interesting about that penmanship is it was maintained to his final days, because he ended up doing his own will and testament, his last will and testament, in his own handwriting, including annotated drawings, which is something you can still visit today at the Fairfax courthouse. You can actually see Washington's will, which is pretty intriguing, and written in his own hand. He did a tremendous amount of writing in his own hand. Well, let's go back, Jeff, to those early days in that concept. George Washington, people forget, was an employee, so to speak. He was a military officer assigned to the British Army. Mm-hmm. George Washington fought for the Brits.
Yes, he did.
And his desire was to climb up that ladder in the British Armed Forces and the British military. And his goal was to be a good army man. I mean, that was what his dream was. But he got stuck in the process because he recognized relatively quickly that regardless of his accomplishments or his ability, the Brits were not going to let any colonial officers ascend to prominent ranks because they were Yankees. They weren't Brits. It's nice to have them around when you need them, but there's no chair at the table for you. And that frustrated Washington greatly. And it caused him to resign from the British military and back to Mount Vernon, where he was trying again to make ends meet at his farm. And from there, he chose instead to move forward in a path of civil governance. And he became a member of the House of Burgesses. And he became a member of, then eventually, he climbed his way up into representative government. So he left the military, back to farming, and then was a good citizen basically in the legislative branch. But if they had opened the doors to him and he had had a seat at the table with the Brits, this whole thing might have changed.
Different
It might have been
ending.
a very different story. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So he goes forward from that situation as a lawmaker, and he is slowly persuaded into the concept of independence. Now, it wasn't that he was late to the game, but he was never a person who was a firebrand. And remember, Washington is in Virginia. The battle in regards to the questions of independence are mostly going on up in Massachusetts.
Right.
That's where the conflict is running. I mean, that's where you've got Sam Adams and the Adams boys, John Adams. That's where you have Lexington Green ultimately in 1775. But the battle over the lack of representation, the problem with taxation, and the sense of the fraying edges with the mother country are really ground zero is Massachusetts. Somewhat Pennsylvania, but mostly Massachusetts. And the Virginians were sort of observers, right? I mean, they were the gentleman farmers. They were the lawmakers. I mean, it was, you've been to Williamsburg, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, they kind of had their stuff all together.
Yeah, and they actually had closer ties to the mother country than Massachusetts, because remember, their religion in Virginia was the Church of England. It was the Anglican Church. And if you go north into Massachusetts, they are the Puritans. They didn't want to have anything to do with the Anglican Church. They were booted out of the Anglican Church.
That's not a small point.
Yeah,
Okay, that is not a small point.
So the Virginians actually had closer ties to England. They were rather reluctant to go for independence. And the further south you went, the stronger the pro-British feelings were, except for Western North Carolina. They hated the Brits. They were all a bunch of fighting Presbyterians, Scots-Irishmen.
And we seldom see that grid. We seldom place that grid over the conversation in colonial America. But it was there was significant worldview differences. And then you also have the Catholic community as well in Maryland. Yep. So you have these different worldviews. And at this stage in the game, your faith confession was one of the most dominant realities of your existence. I mean, you didn't go to the movies. There weren't NBA games. You didn't have soccer groups going on the town square with all the kids. I mean, you went out, you worked for a living, you got up, you went to work, you went to bed, you got up the next day, went to work. And one thing you did at the end on the weekend is you went to church.
When you're talking about Massachusetts, you're talking about Pennsylvania, Virginia, and then Western Carolina. I'm thinking too, there's also not communication happening immediately between these folks. I mean, we're talking days, weeks, months in the time frame that you could communicate what was happening in each of those respective communities back to someone else.
Horseback or sailing vessel. That was it. That was the fastest you could go to communicate through newspapers.
But behind the scenes, reading the correspondence, to be sure, that was coming from Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty and the committees of correspondence, as Adams was America's first internet, he would do the writing of what was going on up in the Massachusetts area, and he would send that information around to all the colonies. And the correspondence that happened there was pivotal. George Washington was watching. He was reading. He was seeing the coming conflict. And he was aligning himself with the first principles of liberty, writing about them privately, and serving in the legislative process in the state of Virginia. And we don't see him on the forefront. Then all of a sudden, Washington appears. And he appears as a Continental Congress is put together. And the Virginia delegation now moves forward. And the interface of that Continental Congress among the 13 colonies puts Washington and several major Virginians right at the forefront.
Let's take our break. This is The Public Square. Interesting conversation today about George Washington. I thought I knew what I needed to know. I've learned some things, and I'm sure you have already. So stay tuned for more. And if you joined us late, or if you have to leave us now, there's always the website, publicsquare.com, where you can listen, or the smartphone app, free in your app store, The Public Square. We'll be back.
Introducing the latest program from the Public Square.
Kids on the Square.
We at Kids on the Square are dedicated to helping teach the next generation through topics like Bible stories, scientific marvels, and American history. We want to equip parents with fun and free educational resources to share the truth with their children. Won't you join us? New episodes are released monthly. You can listen wherever podcasts are available and visit kidsonthesquare.com to find out more. Thank you, and
welcome to Kids on the Square.
Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the Public Square.
We We are the Public Square. Always glad to have you listening. Dave Zanotti is here, along with Alan C. Duncan, our producer, and Jeff Sanders, Melanie Elsie, Rob Walgate, and Wayne Shepard. Our lesson in history today as we look back on the life of George Washington. I did want to ask you, Dave, I think you partially answered this question earlier. What really got you going on George Washington? Was it Dr. Allen?
Yeah, it was Dr. Allen. I did not understand the character of Washington, and to not understand the character of George Washington is to miss the singular most significant character of the founding era, period. And I was in that part. I mean, I was familiar with Jefferson, with Adams. I was a big fan of John Adams because of the work of David McCullough. A big fan of Madison from regards to the Constitutional Convention. I had missed Washington. And when Dr. Allen asked that question about Uncle Tom's cabin and the portrait above the fireplace, that started me on a journey, and it has never stopped. There's no way to explain the presence that Washington earned in the minds and the hearts of the people of the United States. There's so many Washington stories. And we'll talk one more about Dr. Allen. You know, Dr. Allen lives in a little town in Baltimore, which happens to be the place where Lafayette, during the time of the Revolutionary War, brought his troops ashore. And there, in that little area of Maryland, the two, Washington and Lafayette, put together the battle plan that would ultimately win the Battle of Yorktown. It was navigated from outside of Baltimore, and then it was prosecuted at Yorktown. Every place in that town is a historical marker. You talk about, the whole thing about, Washington slept here. Well, in that part of Maryland, Washington slept a lot of places. Okay, and so did Lafayette.
Well rested, apparently. Huh?
He needed it.
They were everywhere, and so he lives in a very historic portion, and so his affection for Washington was intoxicating to me. I mean, I got hooked just hanging around him and listening and watching. But to miss the size and stature of the character of Washington would be to miss so many fundamental lessons about how America came to be America. Now, in the book that I put together, I tried to focus on just 3 words to put that together. And I tried to make them memorable. I tried to put a book together that a family that's on vacation could each read in just a brief amount of time. I tried to put it in such a way that maybe if you were on an airplane, you could get to it and you could read it on the flight there and back, and you will have accomplished something. And then I also try to keep it centered on original source documents. But the 3 words were prescience, precedence, and providence. And what I mean by prescience is that Washington saw things that no one else saw. He didn't lead with his mouth. He led with his eyes and his ears. He saw things, he listened, and he processed these things. And in so doing, he was able to see way down the road. He saw the conflict coming. He saw the huge obstacles that the conflict would present for the American colonies and for their armed forces, which were, Jeff, what would you say? You'd say they were either non-existent or, I mean, we got to put these farmers together and go fight, right?
Well, when Washington took command of the Continental Army outside of Boston in 1776, they just had the Battle of, or not long ago, the Battle of Breed's Hill, also known as Bunker Hill, in which the Americans lost. I mean, at great cost to the British, of course. Yeah, they were a rabble, and they continued to be a rabble throughout that entire year. It really wasn't until Baron von Steuben came to Valley Forge and really instilled some military discipline. I mean, he did what he could. But when the German officer came, he turned them from a rabble into a professional force. And what a lot of people don't realize is that we beat the British at their own game. Washington's army did not fight by hiding behind trees and rocks. Once they were professionally trained, they came out onto the field with muskets and bayonets, and they held their ground like at the Battle of Monmouth, and then they eventually defeated the British.
But Dave, when you were talking about his vision or his ability to see what other people couldn't, You write that Washington was clear in his vision for a permanent federal union of the states long before others would reach such consensus. What would have been different to me if there hadn't been this union of states? Would we not, over the years, have had skirmishes and battles between states,
Oh, yeah.
like small countries do elsewhere in the world? I mean, it would be such a different experience, and we wouldn't have the long-held liberties that were instilled back then.
Melanie, this is one of the most amazing stories, and I think a story that has been really covered up in most of our experiences and in our schools to this very day. And I think that Dr. Allen and David McCullough have done a great amount of work to bring this character back into shape and understanding in our country. I particularly have to give a tremendous amount of credit to Dr. Allen, because he's been on a mission to bring back the character and personality of Washington and to bring back the mind of Washington. George Washington saw the absolute necessity of these colonies becoming a national union. Now, remember, he's a member of the delegation to the Continental Congress from Virginia. These are 13 colonies, and these 13 colonies, once they go to war and they defeat this most powerful country in the world, they're not instantly America. They're 13 independent sovereign states.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Treaty of Paris was signed with each individual state, not with a central government.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant point, Jeff. That's so important, and people forget that. So think about this. Now, you've got a choice to make. I can be my own independent nation, or I can be one state in a nation of 13 states. There were going to be some people in some states that were very well developed, very prominent, states like New York, states like Pennsylvania, maybe even states like Virginia, that would say, tell me exactly why we need a national union. I mean, look, in this confederation of states, this like part-time thing we had going, we whooped the Brits, the French are on our side. Maybe we should put this national thing aside for a while, right? I mean, what would the need be? Why do we need a new? Why it's like we got a really good team going here. We've got 13. We've got a league. We've got a good league going. We've got 13 teams on the field. Why do we need to put it all together into one?
Except under the Articles of Confederation, there were way too many squabbles between the states and very little cooperation. There were all kinds of tax issues. And that's why they had a constitutional convention in 1787, because without some sort of central government, nothing was working out the way they wanted it to work out.
How did they carry on commerce?
Yeah, that was a major issue.
Excellent question. And currency and all of those questions, and then imports and exports. So they had policy questions, to be sure. And so the policy questions were going to require a lot of work. But some people believed that they could do that through treaties, that they could do it and they could work it out one thing at a time, one step at a time, and that they were actually giving up something in regards to their sovereignty. And so why should we do that? It was Washington who understood. And I think there's two things that he recognized from studying his life. He recognized the potential of America. Sorry to throw another P into the mix, that he had the prescience and the vision to see the potential of an America from sea to shining sea. And he recognized it wouldn't just be 13 states very long. And that as this potential continent became the American continent, you'd have to have a better unifying system. That was the first thing he saw. The second thing I believe he saw was the incredible threat of being the new kid on the block. And we forget, even though Washington and his forces, by the merciful grace of Providence in their own admission, they won the war, the Brits didn't go very far away. It wasn't like they left forever. They kind of moved over. And the question of the French being on their side might only last for so long. And what about the Spaniards? What about Spain? They recognized that they were the new kid on the block in a hostile old world. And if they didn't get their act together and unify in some form of a federal system, the chances that ego would tear the 13 independent states apart, they could never come together, or endless wars from the outside would come against them. And if they weren't unified, it'd be like sending an invitation to Great Britain. How about hit us again?
Yeah.
Because we can't get our act together here.
There's much more to learn from the life and times of George Washington. It's coming up on this edition of The Public Square. Dave, I know you've studied George Washington with Dr. William B. Allen's help, of course, and you wrote the book First, The Leadership of George Washington. That book is available, right?
It's still available, Wayne, and this is a nonprofit venture. We don't sell the books so that I get any revenue. All the proceeds are 100% dedicated back to this mobile university that we call the Public Square. And I still read it myself. I learned this from watching David McCullough. I think he never stopped reading his own books.
Interesting.
And someday when I grow up, I would like to be able to do what David McCullough was able to do, which is when you asked him a question about a particular character or something that he had talked about in one of his works, he would open the book as if he knew every single page, find the quote, and read it to you.
That's why he was so impressed when you sat down with him with your dog-eared copy with all the Post-it notes in it. I think it was the Wright brothers
John
book,
Adams,
wasn't it?
No,
was it John Adams?
Yeah,
was it?
yeah.
Okay, all right. I remember you telling the story how impressed he was, or someone telling me that story anyway.
Yeah, he said, "Gee, that one looks like Tom Hanks' edition."
All right, Jeff, you wanted to say more about George Washington, and isn't it amazing that he had this vision, as we said earlier, before the age of information, before information was flowing quickly and back and forth and give and take. He was in isolation in many ways.
Yeah, and he understood that even though he was in isolation in some regard, he didn't know it all. He couldn't know it all. That was impossible. He couldn't be everywhere at once. And so that's why what impresses me is that he was humble enough to enlist the aid of people he knew were more capable, who were smarter. They didn't have to agree with him on everything politically. Whether it was in the military, he brought on board Baron von Steuben or Thaddeus Kosciuszko or Casimir Pulaski, any of these other or certainly the Marquis de Lafayette, these other officers to help him out. When he became president, he said, I need to form a cabinet. I need to have people help me. So he had people of very divergent beliefs, like Thomas Jefferson on one hand as his Secretary of State. And then you had Alexander Hamilton, who later would become famous because of a musical, I suppose. But now Hamilton, I will
That's
give
not his claim to fame. Come on.
Yeah. I want to give Hamilton some credit because in the Siege of Yorktown, Hamilton volunteered to lead a bayonet charge against the British at night. To seize one of the forts. I think it was Redoubt number 9 or number 10. I forgot. Anyway. You got to have some guts to do that.
Yeah. Well, Washington really appreciated Hamilton's military prowess, didn't he?
Yeah, he really did. And so Hamilton was a great help. Jefferson had some issues, I think, but he was not afraid to ask all these various people to come and help me, and his cabinet was very good, very stable, and got a lot done in his 2 terms as president.
Wayne, one of my favorite stories about George Washington happened early in the war. And if you'll forgive me in the spirit of David McCullough, let me read from the text, if I could.
Please do, yeah.
But to leave Washington only to the dollar bill would be a mistake. He's not a one-dimensional character that simply moves the freight of history down the road. Nor is he the wooden character that was simply moved about by the stringed motives of others, more intelligent, visionary, or passionate. No, this young man from Virginia could dance and sing and debate and fight and pray and love with a profound but bridled sense of passion. such as revealed in the dialogue we find of George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Volunteer Army of the United Colonies, in August of 1775. 4 months after the opening shots on Lexington Green, Washington was engaged in armed conflict with his former ally, British General Thomas Gage. A series of letters exists detailing an argument between the two men regarding the way prisoners of war of this emerging battle were being treated by both camps. Gage takes it upon himself to lecture Washington from the authority of the Crown. Washington responded to Gage by calling upon a higher power. He urged Gage to recognize the humanity and brotherhood of all prisoners, regardless of political differences and the unfortunate circumstances of war. He called for compassionate treatment of prisoners on all sides because of their shared humanity. Then Washington turned the conversation from conciliation to prophetic. In his correspondence, Gage had challenged the rightness of the American cause. He had repaired to king and country and challenged the moral authority of the American claim to liberty. He attacked Washington as a usurper of just authority, to which the American general responded, and I quote, "May that God to whom you then appealed judge between America and you. Under his providence, those who influence the councils of America and all the other inhabitants of these united colonies, at the hazard of their lives, are resolved to hand down to posterity those just and invaluable privileges which they received from their ancestors." End quote. He said, "May the God whom you appealed judge between America and you." Those words have a familiar ring, echoing from ancient Israel and the desert of En-Gedi. Outside a cave, the exiled David used very similar words. He confronted the tyrannical King Saul with these words, "May the Lord judge between me and you." That's in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 12. People wonder about the intimacy of Washington's faith. He literally rose up in that spirit of King David and said, "May the Lord judge between me and you, between my country and your country, between your illusion of liberty and God's true definition of liberty." That took a lot of courage.
We've learned so much about Washington. And Dave, I have to ask, I mean, in the circles we run, obviously history comes up an awful lot, but at these events, when the discussion of Washington comes up, I know there has been so much misinformation. How do you handle that now after the last 8-10 years of diving in deep and studying, when someone missteps, if you will, and says something that you know not to be quite historically accurate?
Well, in the era of all the statues are coming down, why should Washington have any standing at all? It brings up a point, Rob, that's important. It's very fortunate for all of us and for our children and grandchildren that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, decades ago, chose to purchase Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington, and to preserve it independent from government funding and from congressional oversight. Mount Vernon is not under the national park systems. It's not something that is appropriated by and exists and is taken care of and curated by the United States Congress. This is a property that is controlled by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Thanks be to God.
Amen.
Because they're able to keep the record true. And their vision from the beginning is to keep Washington's home and all the people who work there, who are characters in the story, so to speak, everything as genuine as possible, so we can go back and stand there independent of historical misrepresentation. You can stand on the ground, you can look at the crops, you can walk through the rooms, you can read the documents for yourself to preserve the genuine integrity of the matter. And that's pivotal. Now, what was your question?
Well, I think all this begs the question, where are the George Washingtons today? Maybe we should talk about that in our final segment coming up. If you have to leave us at this time, be sure to listen online, thepublicsquare.com, or with that smartphone app.
We will be right back for more on the Public Square. Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the Public Square.
Let's continue talking about George Washington today, here a few days after President's Day. But as we sit and have this conversation, it is the holiday itself, which you understand, of course. And Melanie, you've got more to say about George.
I just think we have a dire responsibility as parents, as teachers, anyone who is instructing children, at least middle school on up. Day's book first should be a primer, for the junior high school age, but high school age going into college, it should be Dr. Allen's work, Dr. McCullough's work, 1776. These works exist and are tools to undo the poor education structures that we've had in the past and re-educate the next generation of adults.
Yeah, and these books also don't shy away from, they don't make Washington a perfect person either. They're
Right.
trying to
Just thinking
present
the same
an
thing, yeah.
accurate
A
portrayal.
great description of history.
Sure.
Yeah,
they don't. They don't duck
and we
any
learn from
issues.
his failures, don't we?
Yes.
As we should.
This is where Dr. Allen had the courage to start this conversation from Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Mm-hmm.
What brilliant strategy. What brilliant strategy to start there, because, of course, in this age of cancel culture, Washington's statue must come down because as a child at the age of 14 years of age, he inherited slaves. He didn't go buy them. I think it started even as young as he was 11. And then when he was married, there were more slaves on his property through marriage. And Washington wrestled with that question from a moral perspective from as long as we can remember. And it is, in and of itself, it is a magnificent story of perseverance, personal struggle, and how we so misunderstand what it was like to be in the shoes of the people who were there. To understand history and the challenges that we all face, you have to go back 100 years before the subjects in history that you're studying. And we talked about this with David McCullough at length. You've got to go back 100 years behind their eyes to understand what their grandparents lived through, what they learned from their grandparents, what they learned from their parents, the world as it existed that they inherited. What were the opportunities? What were the liabilities? What were the possibilities? How far in one lifetime could you solve a problem? How far? Because all problems, very few of them are solved in the snap of a finger or with one personal checkbook or one single administration of a president or a reign of a king or the rule of Congress. These things take time, because even in dictatorial countries, it takes time for the dictator to exercise his will over the people, let alone for people developing self-government for the very first time at this level to be able to process and overcome the bad habits that they inherited upon their birth. None of the people of the founding era invented slavery. It came with the reality and the package. It was like Dr. Allen said, it was in the water. They were fish in the tank. It was in the water that they literally lived in. And Washington did everything he could to the last breath of his life in regards to making it clear that he did not believe that slavery was right or sustainable. He did everything within his power, was not perfect, but everything within his power to do with what he had inherited and the labor force that he needed to be able to leave his property and serve his country almost his entire adult life at the cost of never making money at Mount Vernon, barely keeping the place alive. But and in the legislative process, wherever he had opportunity, he worked to the cause of abolition. But just because he was president didn't mean he could sign an executive order. They didn't do that back then. We had a constitutional form of government. You couldn't just write a rule and wipe out slavery. You had to have all the states involved. You had to have the Congress involved. Washington took that as far as he could, and then at the end of his life, he set up in his will immediately that the slaves that were left at Mount Vernon would be freed. And Martha's slaves, which he had no legal control over, were then to be freed upon her death. And because he went first, that ended up causing all of the slaves at Mount Vernon to receive their liberty in short order after Washington's death. That was his final testimony to the nation and to the world, that he literally signed the death warrant for his own property and for Martha's survival and property by surrendering his slaves, saying, I fought against this my whole life. I've not been able to conquer it single-handedly, but at least here and now, I release it all. And he set the precedent going forward.
Even though in his generation and generations before him, they had inherited slaves.
Oh, yes. And again, he did everything he could in his lifetime, and he did so at the final cost. A few decades later, because there was no workforce at Mount Vernon, and because of the fact that there had never been a significant cash flow there, the place was in complete virtual disrepair. He bankrupted his own legacy to release the slaves.
And did it, as you said, as an example for other people to follow, hopefully, in the future.
Yes, because here is the outsized singular character of integrity in our country, admitting that which was wrong and resolving it as best he could in his one singular lifetime. Again, was anything of it perfect? No. But people who dismiss him and pull down his statue as if he was a guy who never cared and never tried, that's just a grave injustice against reality.
Well, and that's something that Mount Vernon does well to this day, is they have people that portray enslaved people there and tell the stories of people like William Lee. Like you were mentioning, his longtime employee, they have a man there that portrays him. So you have even the legacies of some of the slaves live on, even at Mount Vernon to this day. Their stories are told.
One of the most moving hours of my life was when it was the hour that we spent. Of course, we spent an entire day at Mount Vernon with Dr. Allen on a very private tour because he's greatly respected there. And we went into the area where the graveyard of the former slaves in Mount Vernon, where their remains are. And it's a very sacred place. And it's a very open conversation. And it was a powerful moment to walk through that area and talk with Dr. Allen about it. And Dr. Allen I've watched him work with some of the most hostile people I've met, who've been raised in a much more woke environment and who are absolutely convinced that all the founders must be purged as the most desperate of villains because of the issue of slavery. And without making any justification for slavery whatsoever, Dr. Allen has an amazing ability with simple facts and simple reality and simple human understanding to explain the challenge this was and the obstacle it was to overcome. And that Washington, of all people, walked through this bad situation that he didn't start, and that even as president, he did not have the singular power to end. But Dr. Allen makes a great case that there was very little Washington could have done than he did do. And one final point, there might be some people screaming at the radio saying, well, why didn't he just release the slaves and suffer the loss? That's simple. He was going to suffer the loss. He was never making money there. The loss was already there. What most people never stop to think about is by releasing the slaves in the environment that they would have been released into, he could very well likely would have done far more harm to those people than to care for them, and upon their release, try to establish them as freed people with as much resources as possible. He had their concern in mind as well.
And why don't we see that kind of leadership today, Dave?
Well, Wayne, we started off with Jeff pointing out that Washington climbed up as a young man, and he learned these things very early. I would suggest that if we could start with a new generation, a next generation, and teach these first principles in the context of reality, that we might have a chance that Washington could still yet inspire many to be true leaders.
Team, thank you for the conversation today. And if you joined us late, you can always listen online to the entire program, thepublicsquare.com, or with our smartphone app. We'll see you next time.
The Public Square is a broadcast service of the American Policy Roundtable.